All right, are we live? We are. It looks like we are live and we are recording. Shall I go ahead, Linda?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today or on another day when you are interested in this subject. My name is Sarrah Christensen. I have been practicing astrology since about 2013 as a someone who offers that to other individuals seeking assistance with astrology as a tool. You can find me at One Sage's View on Instagram or Facebook. My links are here and my website is here. Today I'm going to be talking about Saturn in Aquarius, square Uranus in Taurus. So here we go. Next slide. So to start off the conversation before we dive into all the nuts and bolts of Saturn and Uranus and the cycle, I wanted to just kind of take a pause. I know we've had a lot of information coming at us and kind of look at it from the bigger picture. And I love Rumi, and here's some of the quotes that I just wanted to pick up from to share in the moment, because it is a lot going on right now, and I think it's that we always have to come back to center and look at, you know, what's going on with us right in the center. And I love these quotes from Rumi for kind of stilling my mind and finding that place of connection within to something bigger. So I just want to put these here for you to enjoy. A few of my favorites. Given various ways of feeling, ways of being in the moment. And you may look at one or two that really speak to you in this moment. So I just wanted to share this, and you can read them on your own. Next slide. All right. So the Aquarius ingress for Saturn is happening here in just day after tomorrow, and that's going to shift a lot of energy from the Capricorn and going into Aquarius, a fixed air sign. So that's March 21st, 2020, and a lot of us will feel that when we are moving into that from a cardinal sign into the fixed air. That will move forward up until about May 10th, 2020, and then Saturn's going to station retrograde just in the first 2 degrees. It basically is like 1 degree, 40 something minutes. But on that day is when it stations retrograde. So it's going to have an emphasis and a feeling of that Saturn in Aquarius being emphasized for us, every one of us, the week prior to that and the week after for sure, because it's really almost like standing still in the sky. So it really emphasizes that, the archetypal energy of Aquarius there at the beginning degrees. And then it marches back through in the transits on the retrograde and through Aquarius back to Capricorn on July 1st. 2020 will re-enter the sign of Capricorn in the retrograde cycle, and it will continue finishing its what it is for us to master on the Capricorn Saturn through the end of the year. So even though we have this brief a few weeks, or I think it's like 14 weeks in Aquarius, we will be returning back to the Capricorn, and so we'll be finishing up kind of that business in Capricorn for Saturn towards the end of the year. So while in Capricorn in the retrograde, it kind of steps back all the way till September 19th in 2020, and then we're going to have the stationing direct. And that's about 24, 25 degrees of Capricorn. And again, because it will be stationing, that means it slows down its speed. And so it emphasizes that archetypal energy for us all. A couple weeks before and a couple weeks after that September 19th date will be very, really potent with that energy. And then it's stationing direct then, so then it will be moving forward towards the end of the year until it re-enters the sign of Aquarius on December 17th, 2020. And then we have just a couple days later, the Saturn and Jupiter conjunction in Aquarius. And that's going to be December 22nd, right after the winter solstice, when the sun goes into Capricorn. And that is a beginning of a very significant cycle for Jupiter and Saturn, which is pretty much their cycles will be in air for the next 200 years. And then we will see Saturn will leave Aquarius and enter Pisces on March 7th of 2023. So those are some dates you can kind of keep in mind and note on your calendar. So next slide, please. So my talk today is going to be focusing on the Saturn from a square position, a square aspect with Uranus, which is moving through Taurus right now. So it really doesn't become exact until 2021, as you can see the dates here. February 17th will be exact with a square with Uranus. February 17th, 2021 at 7 degrees and 14 minutes of Aquarius and Taurus. And then through the retrograde cycle, it will do it again on June 14th of 2021 at 13 degrees and 7 minutes Aquarius and Taurus. And then its final square that is exact when Saturn's moving direct again, December 24th of 2021. So this is important just to kind of keep in terms of the dates that are on the horizon for the exact, though when Saturn moves into Aquarius, it has an applying aspect. So it is still notable and strong, but it won't become exact until next year. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of history. So as we go into this cycle, as we go into the Saturn and Aquarius, applying to the square with Uranus, we want to have an understanding of what happened last time. What's the cycle that we're looking at in terms of Saturn and Aquarius, just taking that component first. So the last cycle, February 6, 1991, that was when Saturn entered Aquarius, and then it left in 1994, January 28th of 1994. So that's kind of giving you the kind of the bookends of the cycle of Saturn in Aquarius last time. I like to go and look at, okay, what was going on that year? So I just look up, I go to Wikipedia, look up 1991 and kind of look at the events and things that would jump out that are very Aquarian across what you find in the Wikipedia page for that year. Same thing for 1994, because it'll have another bookend, kind of what's closing out the cycle of being in that sign. That kind of gives you some archetypal information around Aquarius. Then the retrograde cycles will give you emphasis of where the energy is more potent, and when it's slowing down to station retrograde, and when it's slowing down to station direct. And that in history, in the last cycle, was May 17th of 91. It stationed retrograde at 6 degrees of Aquarius. But what's interesting, it did not re-enter Capricorn in 1991. It stayed it stayed in Aquarius. It backed up to the 0 degrees and 11 minutes of Aquarius, and then stationed direct on October 5th at that point, and then went forward. Again, May 28th of 1992, there was another retrograde station in 18 degrees of Aquarius, 29 minutes, and then went forward when it stationed direct after October 16th, 1992, at 11 degrees of Aquarius, 49 minutes. And then again, exiting Aquarius and entering Pisces on May 21st, 1993. So by just looking at the year, like it's going into the sign, the year that it's leaving is two bookends that you can look at, but also when it's stationing, because that will heighten the energy and give you some more insights into how those things that were happening then may be patterns that come visible to us again, that are revisited. So, and of course, exits Aquarius back on January 28th, 1994. Next slide, please. So continuing on with just some historical perspective, the entire relationship with the planet they're called synodic cycles. We often will look at a planet with the sun having a synodic cycle. You can do the same with any combination of planets. And in this case, we're looking at Saturn and Uranus. And so their conjunction, the last conjunction, to give us an idea of what we're looking at right now as we approach this last square, is we kind of have to look at the whole thing. And so we want to look at that, and that date that Saturn and Uranus began the cycle was February 12th of 1988. And they began that cycle at the 29th degree of Sagittarius, 55 minutes, just 5 minutes of arc before it was going to go into Capricorn. So all of the themes of a 29th degree of Sagittarius, a mutable sign, is really important, a part of what we're looking at in terms of Saturn in the Sag, and Uranus in the Sag. And what that would look like as we go through a full cycle and mature through the phases of that cycle. Here I have the dates of the waxing square. You can see July 17th, 1999 was the first square at 15 degrees. And that would have been Saturn in Taurus and Uranus in Aquarius. And then November 14th, 1999 at 13 degrees 4 minutes. And then May 13th, 2000 at 20 degrees 46 minutes. And so that waxing square was it had a retrograde cycle, so you can kind of see how it would first take a hit, then go back, and then forward again. So, but what we're in now is the waning. We are in the closing cycle, or we're approaching the closing cycle, which truly starts that true exact in 2021, which I shared on a couple slides ago. So the waning now is kind of the last quarter, and how current we're seeing this kind of maturity of the storyline of Sagittarius in a crisis kind of scenario here for travel, higher education, just the restrictions of how the universities are handling the present moment, the present crisis that we're handling. Schools, all the elementary schools, all of the high schools, their middle schools, they're all closed, and having to do something very, very different online, and managing classrooms in a very different kind of environment. Additional to that, there's the absolute need for social distancing and new mandates and rules and distribution and supply issues. All of these can be tied to like the Sagittarius from the education, to Gemini from the schools and all of that. So you look at that, but primarily the focus on the Sag that was the beginning of the cycle, and then how things operate through the archetype of these two planets moving through the fixed signs of Taurus and Aquarius. Okay, so this coming square that I'm talking about is the waning square, and it is symbolic of. Go ahead and next slide, please. Is a few things. I like to look at history, what was happening. I just pulled some kind of key things that were happening at that particular time of the beginning of the cycle, and you keep in mind what may have matured since then, or what has it's like a new level of a paradigm that we have to operate within, because that's kind of like what the maturity of the cycle is happening. So back in February of 1988, I just looked at the headlines. What was going on when Saturn entered Aquarius before? Well, the Winter Olympics in Calgary, Canada were there, and we had also kind of a lot. I didn't take all of the violent things that were on the news to consider, but that is a consideration when you have Uranus involved in some cases, not all cases, but definitely in the history. So you can, I didn't want to list out the volume that were listed there, but you can see them. There was a bomb blast outside of a bank, and bank is some symbolism within the Taurus archetype. 27 were killed and 70 were injured. That was on the day that it entered, by the way, I do believe. And then shortly, just a couple weeks later after that, the collapse of the Soviet Union was marked in history on February 27th and 29th. That year of 88, and that was significant as we saw so much change and transition for all of those individuals as a part of that country's identity. Then, of course, the Iran-Iraq war was ending with over 1 million lives lost, and that was that summer, August 20th of 1988. George H.W. Bush was elected president that year in November, on November 10th, in the United States of America. Also, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, an independent state of Palestine is proclaimed at the Palestinian National Council meeting in Algiers by a vote, and that's really significant. And I think that shows the Uranian and the Saturn Aquarius kind of energy, but also from the Sagittarius, because it's happening at the beginning of the cycle, because we've had other things related to those two nations happening throughout this 32-year cycle, so far what we know so far, right? For the past 32 years or so. And that was by a vote of 253 to 46. Benazir Bhutto, I hope I said her name right, was sworn in as Prime Minister of Pakistan. She was the first woman head of government of an Islam-dominated state. And so her story might be interesting to understand kind of themes of this particular Saturn and Uranus cycle. What are we learning? What are we becoming and understanding as a collective during this cycle? And then, of course, I thought this was interesting because of the symbolism as well, was the first transatlantic telephone cable to use optical fibers was completed. Now, they didn't have an exact date, but it was recorded for 1988. And of course, the first World AIDS Day is held December 1st of 1988. So this is kind of the snapshot of the beginning of the cycle for Saturn and Uranus. Next slide, please. So you have events that happen, and that brings in the newness of this combination of the archetypes at the newness of the cycle 1988. And then it moves forward to the first opening square. And the first opening square is the waxing square, and we have specific dates for that. The first exact square was on July 17th of 1999. And by retrograde, November 14th, 1999, and again, finally on May 13th of 2000. So I took an array of events that looked fairly symbolically important for kind of what would go on at the beginning of a cycle in the first square. And here are a few on those dates. I don't know if people remember a Napster back in 99, June 1st, 1999. Napster was a music download service, and it debuted. It was really, really huge at the time, I remember. June 9th, 1999, there was a peace treaty signed, the Kosovo War, oh, I said that right, for Yugoslavia and NATO. That was really, really significant. June 19th, Turin, Italy was awarded the 2006 Winter Olympics. July 10th, American soccer player Brandi Chastain scores the game-winning penalty kick against China in the final of the FIFA Women's World Cup. And I remember that as well in my memory as being really significant, and it kind of embodied the Uranian unexpected outcome. July 16th is really for the United States a big date. In 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. died with his wife and her sister in a plane crash near Martha's Vineyard. And this was like really key, almost remembering his father, but having his early death for how old he was really significant in the collective. July 20th, the Mercury program, the Liberty Bell 7, piloted by Gus Grissom in 1961, is raised from the Atlantic Ocean. And I thought that was significant in terms of this symbolism between Saturn and Uranus as well. October, we don't have an exact day, but NASA lost one of its probes, the Mars Climate Orbiter, that year. And then November 20th of 1999, China launches the first Zhenzhou spacecraft. And you can kind of get a sense of this kind of crisis. These are like first crises, right? They have themes around very Aquarian and Uranian themes that are opening this first square of the cycle. Then November 30th, the ExxonMobil merger is completed, and that formed the largest corporation in the world. And keep in mind the symbolism of that from a Saturnian, the Saturn kind of concept, but also what is that, how is that igniting some big question in our collective of how we look at corporations? This is a significant moment for that. And then what we do with that over the rest of the cycle, and how that's going to shape possibly our relationship to the corporation as we know it for now. December 3rd, there was a key moment for someone in a first. After rowing 81 days, rowing on the Atlantic Ocean, Tory Burden became the first woman to cross the Atlantic by a rowboat alone. And she reached, I think it's Guadalupe, and from the Canary Islands. So that was a significant moment. And so that one kind of made me think of going back to the beginning of the cycle, the Sagittarius, 29 degrees, 55, and kind of like how she's doing this first in that archetypal energy and coming at this moment at the square. So that would be a very interesting example of case study to look at even more closely pertaining to this cycle. And then finally, May 5th, 2000, there was the computer virus. I don't remember. This was global. The I Love You computer virus that spread around the world after starting in the Philippines. So that was a virtual one, but here we are in an actual epidemic, pandemic situation. And then finally, May 13th, 2000, kind of at the end, which is the exact day that the last exact square, first square, waxing square happened. There was a fireworks factory disaster in the Netherlands that killed 23 people. And these help us understand kind of archetypal energy at play. Thank you. Next slide, please. So then the planets move through their phase, and they reach their peak, the fullness of the phase, the Saturn and Uranus in opposition to each other on November 4th of 2008 and February 5th, 2009 through the retrograde cycle, and then again back on the direct on September 15th of 2009. And at the full phase, of course, we see kind of the maturity of the cycle, and then it's important to kind of what was happening then, because that was kind of like the bloom of the potentials that were at the beginning. And so November 1st, Nakamoto publishes Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And we have definitely seen how Bitcoin has been very volatile, and right now it's really crashing. There's still a significant amount of volatility to that idea, and how it will stay or not stay. Will it survive this cycle at all? We'll see. November 4th of 2008, Senator Barack Obama was elected the 44th president of the United States, and that was very Aquarian. There was a lot of firsts with that, and what he represented for what was happening in the United States at that moment, becoming the first African American elected president of the United States. November 19th, Claudia Castillo of Spain became the first person to have a successful trachea transplant using a tissue-engineered organ. And again, this is very interesting as a full bloom moment in 2008. To understand the Saturn and Uranus cycle from the bioengineering and medical world, how those archetypes brought this into manifestation. So that's a first, and where it goes from there and how it grows. December 5th, there was human remains found in 1991 that were identified as the Tsar Nicholas II of Russia using DNA analysis. That was significant, and then how DNA and is really how the science of DNA and how we're using it now and through ancestry and other things, and that continues to evolve in how we look at it collectively. And of course, there are also things of challenge that would be represented in the waning square from that DNA, how we use it. June 11th, 2009 was the outbreak of H1N1 influenza strain, the swine flu. It was deemed a global pandemic on that day. So we saw that that's significant to see. Wow, that was at the full phase. So we were going through a lot similar things, but they are different in how we're handling at this approaching waning square. July 22nd, 2009 was the longest solar eclipse of the 21st century at that time, that lasted up to 6 minutes and 38 seconds. 38.8 seconds, and it occurred over parts of Asia and the Pacific Ocean. Now, I don't have enough time to do more research, but I would wonder how that particular solar eclipse was over the areas of China as being they're in the as an originating location, and how they might from the planetary positions over that area. That'd be interesting to kind of check into as a case study. Next slide, please. Okay, so during the Saturn in Aquarius square Uranus, there are kind of ongoing things that we're looking at. There's usually the fear of change, because Uranus is, of course, the sudden changes, and Saturn is the fear may be involved with that. So it's kind of, how do we work with that? And it's kind of like cautious reform. It's being responsible and reforming things that we can work on together to do that. Breaking the tradition, breaking with tradition, breaking old lines of authority. That's kind of what happens in this kind of energy, the Saturn squaring Uranus. Uranus is really, okay, it's now, and bringing us forward with that. We have unexpected breaks or unexpected breaks. So it's literally, check your brakes. And then just breaks in what we thought was going to be the pattern and the stability of something, and how that's changing. And we're all kind of knee deep in that, or up to our eyeballs in that right now. Surprising disruptions, rebels that topple the old paradigm can also be part of that archetypal energy when Saturn is in Aquarius square the Uranus. New ideas come about because they're forced to. There's accelerated reform because it's a must. The Saturn-Uranus conjunction in Capricorn in 1987, Russian, well, it was that was the USSR back then. Mikhail Gorbachev led a reform, a major reform of what we used to know as the CSSR. Saturn-Uranus also old things resurface to be reviewed again. And so this can happen by an individual and how it is in their charts, but it also can happen collectively as a state. I live in a state, but I also live in the United States of America, so I can also take it from a national perspective. And for those around the world who are listening to this, it would be almost, what is your country, and then what kind of providence or something that you live in, and what those changes are happening, and how are those reforms, how it works, how is the Uranus energy coming in and influencing reforms and laws related to how you operate as a collective in a physical place. Astrologer Charles Carter described the Saturn-Uranus as being very democratic in spirit and autocratic in method, and that's kind of the Saturnian view of Saturn in more of a traditional look, I guess. Oh, not traditional, the wrong word. A more serious Aquarian look. But to me, the Uranus influence here is kind of what breaks that, what's been inflexible, what's been dictatorial, what has been tyrannical. And what is interesting is really paying attention to that now, because right before this really spread the way it did, the coronavirus across the globe, there were different things in different countries politically going on. And just look how quickly things are having to change daily to take care of people. And which is interesting. Saturn and Uranus is definitely at play already. But it gets more exact as we move into next year. So it becomes the first square then, though we will be operating just because it's square close enough by degree when it goes in. As soon as it enters into Aquarius, that's the case. We're kind of out of sign, so it's still in Earth now. When it goes into the fixed air, there's going to be the feeling more of the square, the tension of the square. Next slide, please. So, this is a detail that I used in a recent presentation I did on all synodic cycles. And this one is from Gloria Strathis. I think I said her name right. Basically, it's just a definition of the last quarter phase. So once we reach the exactness of the quarter, the waning squared next year, this is kind of what turns on. So it's kind of basically it's the most challenging part is one cannot go back to where we were before the change was created, and the future is really so unknown. So we're really in that don't know, what are we going to do? But it's only 75% through the cycle. It's not even all the way. So you have to really still work towards the end of the cycle. This portion of the phase of this Saturn and Uranus is rethinking on ideas and what's the information that we have now. What was created and how was it received, or how was it accepted, and how did we experience it? We prepare for the upcoming cycle by what takes place in the last quarter phase. And if there was anything I wanted to bring in this presentation, is that's where we're going to be stepping into next year, is what do you do from that point till the end of that cycle, till the new. And really, really important, because it's reorientation. We're all going to be really changing in such dynamic ways, I think, as how we collectively operate, both in what we do in distance and physically, but also in what we do on a day-to-day basis in our own local environment as well. So what we kind of figure out, what works well, what we want to do, how do we want to do something, the ideas still come, and it's just how we're going to navigate it. That might be different in how we do that. Intuition may draw one towards very specific areas of study now. There can be kind of a gut level, like I'm drawn this way. You check in with that, and you have to kind of build your intuition and trust with yourself, because that's going to help direct you. And if you don't know something, you can ask people, befriend people, and build community that way too. There's often subtle hints that are felt, and we must listen carefully to hear them and feel them, and for where the path is directing each individual. That is very Aquarian. So the key word for this, that phase when we go truly into the final square, which is the waxing square, the closing square, is reorientation. And you can be thinking about that now. You have maybe ample time to do so. Okay. Next slide. So it might be helpful to look at how Saturn is in Capricorn versus how Saturn is different when it is in a fixed air sign. So Saturn, just as a planet, focuses our attention to our responsibility, our discipline, our collective efforts. So when it's in Aquarius, it's really focused on the group collective, the group think. How are we collectively working together? And often the intention is for the greater good, right? We're all kind of in isolation, distancing now for the greater good, for helping flatten the curve. The New York Times, having that, it's like what we're doing is trying to help, so we don't have a huge spike hitting our resources, our finite resources, to manage large volume of cases that might need help. So the social distancing helps. That's the first lesson, I think, this physical thing that we're doing to work together. And I don't know about your communities. My community, in a big way, is helping out the local restaurants, those who are going to be more impacted by, I'm going to make sure that I order from the restaurants because I can, by picking up food and keeping those businesses available, so when they come back online from the distancing situation, they are able to do so. So there's a lot of different things going on in that regard. The fear component is part of the Saturn responsibility part. We have to manage our fears, but we're managing it through really unexpected stuff, which is the Uranus, and that's the disruptive part, the volatility that Uranus brings into the mix, where we think something is stable, like that there's toilet paper on the grocery shelves, but there's not. So you have to understand, when is it coming in, or how we adapt to that, or how we figure out how we're going to operate now, because certain resources are having an impact immediately, and how we are having to adjust and adapt. Simultaneously, there's new ideas coming forward and bringing solutions to the problems through innovation that benefits the whole. This is also happening. And I look for those stories. I like to share those stories. And then they're just knowing that there is the pressure of the square, and it acts and it feels like Mars. The square is an aspect that's very Mars-like. So it pokes at you, it disrupts your flow. It can be destructive, but you have to act. You have to be brave. You have to choose. You have to use your free will. So next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the moment, because this video could be seen by someone 2-3 years from now, maybe at the another moment in time, but still relevant. Saturn, when it's ruling both the signs of Capricorn and Aquarius, we're still in Capricorn until it actually moves fully into Aquarius. So the headlines right now have more of the Capricorn influence here, even though, and I would say that this ties into kind of like the bleed over from the Saturn-Pluto-Capricorn conjunction that we all experienced in January of this year, January 12th, 2020. So the headlines at the moment, you know, Washington weighs big bailouts to help economy survive. These are all from the New York Times, by the way. The Times is providing free access on the global coronavirus crisis. Stocks drop and oil crashes as investors' alarm persists. You know, there's live updates on that. Just everybody watching the money, the currency, the investments. New York's food distribution. This is the Taurus piece. This is Uranus already in Taurus. A part of this, networks brace for an unprecedented threat. The tech headaches from working from home and how to remedy them. That's the Uranus, but also I think this is kind of the forward kind of thinking of the Aquarian. We're not quite there yet, so full solutions aren't available. It's not out there everywhere where everybody feels the shift that they're comfortable with it. Not that they're going to be comfortable with it if they haven't already done it, but it's the Capricorn. It's like, okay, you have to be responsible for figuring this thing out, kind of thing. There aren't enough ventilators to cope with the coronavirus. This is a resource volatility issue as well, as a part of this thing. And then a promising treatment for coronavirus fails. So work in progress. I've seen other news just in the last 12 hours about that. So attributes of Capricorn and Aquarius, just a real quick list on that we can take a look at, understanding the differences especially for new students to astrology. This is a good slide to kind of go back and forth on understanding Saturn in Cap versus Saturn in Aquarius. And from a modern perspective, there's absolutely the Uranian, Uranus within the Aquarian rulership, so that plays into that as well. And I'm getting, okay, thank you. So these are some great keywords just to drop in and get comfortable going back and forth. And maybe you can sense more Aquarian themes coming in, of innovators coming forward with maybe vaccine solutions, coming more like, oh, yep, we got something that's really, I just saw something yesterday regarding a news story on that, but maybe it gets more realized when Saturn fully is in Aquarius, because we're kind of in the 29th degree right now. And I think it's not that far, we're very close. So you can see kind of the forward thinking, the genius is available more when Saturn is in the fixed sign of Aquarius, versus the traditional way of doing things from the Cap. And our systems are struggling with the traditional way of doing things. And the Senex, the elder, versus, you know, the genius. There's the authority figures, and how are they operating in kind of the Capricorn archetype versus where it will go with the Aquarian archetype. The fringe, like, let's do something different here, coming forward in the figureheads who are our authority figures, or who rises out of this in tone, when people will be eager to hear a leader who can language what to do with a calm sense of bringing people into, you know, adapting to something new. So it's kind of looking at that archetype. And then, you know, the Capricorn earthly personality, personas, responsible, but in Aquarian, it's responsible, but it's responsible for a bigger picture. It's more concerned with the group consciousness. It's more concerned with mind. It's more concerned with how does this fare for everybody, not just a few, right? So that's part of this shift that's happening when Saturn goes into Aquarius. Now, both signs have positive attributes, and both signs have shadow components, or attributes that aren't very helpful for how we operate. But you'll see both. you know, in the world collectively and in your community and within your own small family. So, you know, looking at the duty-driven individual versus how working together, like, can you do this, you know, helping out in the collective way. Melancholy or moodiness or the disassociation of the Aquarian energy or the aloofness of the Aquarian energy. Saturn in Cap is kind of alone on the top of the mountain versus being surrounded by friends, the Aquarian energy. There's a seeking of perfection in the Capricorn energy, where Saturn in Aquarius is more like looking at giving shape. That's the Saturn part, to commonalities and the intellect being used to manifest something that works. Saturn in Capricorn is about how we're working on structure, it initiates structure, the cardinal energy of that. But in Saturn, that then becomes something that is refined. It refines existing structures, or old structures just completely die away because they lose their purpose or how we operate because of a changing paradigm. And that's the Aquarian part of the Saturn in the Aquarius. Time and patience in Capricorn, whereas Saturn in Aquarius, it also uses time, but it uses time in an understanding, like breakthroughs and ideas from that. There's a different way that Saturn operates in the Aquarian in terms of time, because it's like, over time, if we do this as a group, what would be the end result, you know, versus just one, you know, a person, you know, climbing the mountain to hit the milestone for their individual goal or individual focus. But it's the Capricorn is the cardinal. The Saturn in Aquarius is the refinement and how we work with it from the cerebral mind perspective. Capricorn is milestone based more, where Saturn in Aquarius wants to do it. It's more like very individual and a little bit rebellious. It does things different. There's a freedom of the individual as a part of the component of the whole thing. Saturn in Cap tends to have a little bit more controlled authority, where Saturn in Aquarius looks at the freedom of the individual as well. And then we're also looking at systems, structures, how the society is operating. You can really sense that right now in the end of the Capricorn energy that we have going on right now. And then as it moves forward into Aquarius, individuality within the groups, within the collective, those may take time. That's another theme. Even in Aquarius, it'll take time to see how the individuality comes out within the groups, within the collective. If that makes sense. Saturn over time, there's community ideals that Saturn in Aquarius is focused for. Saturn in Capricorn is also about expectations, where Saturn in Aquarius is more, has a detached tonality to it. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here is the slide of the Saturn ingress that happens March 21st, and that's Saturday for me, maybe Sunday for folks on the other side of the world. So I created the chart for Washington, D.C., so this is Eastern Daylight Time, and you can see the Saturn is in Aquarius. They're in the end of the second house, on the edge of the third house. I don't see the degrees of the actual house cusp, but not an issue. The rising sign for Washington, D.C. is Scorpio, which brings in Mars, and Mars is very powerful there, 23 degrees 59 Capricorn, with applying to a conjunction with Pluto at 24 degrees of Capricorn, and had Jupiter's right there as well at 23 Capricorn 3 minutes. So powerful chart. Interesting. That's in our money house in the United States of America. So money, it'll be interesting. there's going to be a volatility to it, because if you consider that Saturn is there and it's square to Uranus, Uranus is over there at the end of the 5th house in Taurus at 4 degrees 38 minutes. And it is in the the sign squaring, so it is squaring, and Saturn is applying to the Uranus, but again, it doesn't catch up to it, so it doesn't perfect the exact square until next year. So this just kind of intensifies the square feeling when it jumps into the air, when he doesn't really jump, he moves into the air sign, and gives us that true by sign square, and square enough with a planet like Saturn to really feel the tension, which will probably give us some insight to what we'll be dealing with next year as well. If there's anything, I would argue that. There will be different volatile things of volatility that are Taurus based that we will have to manage through. And Saturn in Aquarius, I think there will be a tone that is about the collective, is about the community, is about how can we manage and be as healthy as we can be, given all things. And so there will be some struggling with this, of course. I would say many are struggling with this big change in how to conduct themselves, or how to go into isolation. Those who are really like being out there and being with the public, and that's where they get their energy. This is going to be a hard time for that. But it will. What I'm also noticing in the community is how many are reaching out to help others. That is really big going on in my community. I don't know in the bigger cities if so, but I live in a community that's less than 300,000 people over 4 cities, kind of spread out. So I guess it varies by location for people, but the tonality of how's your neighbor doing is more important and more something that's in our awareness now, I think, than ever. So this is a good chart to look at from just when I look at when a planet, like an outer planet like Saturn, goes into a sign. I look at the ingress chart, because there's so many things that we can look at that are, what's this going to look like while Saturn, this particular example, goes into this sign? What are the themes while it's in the sign are in that ingress chart? Now, in a couple of days, or actually tonight, excuse me, not even a couple of days, tonight we have the equinox. And the Aries equinox, the vernal equinox, when the sun moves into Aries, is a chart that all the mundane astrologers use that give us information for not just the whole year, but also it depends on what the rising sign is for where they create the chart for whatever location. So what's the rising sign? Is it cardinal, fixed, or mutable? And then that determines if they're going to use another chart, such as the autumn equinox, or if they only use the vernal equinox chart for the whole year. That really decides what you do there. So if you study mundane astrology, or you're interested in mundane astrology, it's fascinating, and those charts are really powerful from looking at things from a collective perspective, and nation-based. If you want to look at it from the United States of America, you look at the United States chart with the Aries ingress chart, and you would do same thing for Canada, or any country in Europe, or any country anywhere in the world. So you just have to know your main chart that your country uses the most, I think, is going to be helpful for you. So as we can see in the chart for the Saturn ingress into Aquarius, Ceres is right in the middle of Aquarius. And interesting, she is an important dwarf planet that we look at in evolutionary astrology, related to grief sometimes, and relationships with the mother archetype, and how we take care of ourselves and how we feed ourselves in the harvest, things like that. So that's kind of interesting, and a topic that we can explore later. I just wanted to point that out, that she is in the sign with Saturn in Aquarius, and that's kind of interesting. What's changing in the things that are symbolized by Ceres? We have also at the moment that Saturn enters into Aquarius, still the pileup in Capricorn with the Jupiter, well, Pallas Athena there, Jupiter, Mars, and Pluto, and Cherclo. As that we've been talking about Cherclo a lot more. So we still have quite a few significant things in Capricorn at that moment. So those themes are a part of, from my perspective, the storyline that's going to probably be through the entire period that Saturn is in Aquarius. And so Saturn is in Aquarius for about 3 years. That's the cycle. Saturn usually is in a sign for about 3 years. So you can look at I have more charts here in a minute, but consider that. Consider that how our money is, how there's some kind of transformational relationship we have with what we value right now in a big way, and then new ideas coming in, new ideas from the Saturn and Aquarius, and how we may shape that. What comes in, what is coming in, what is being born, what is being shaped by this moment of the ingress chart. But you can also look at the Aries ingress chart as well from this year, which will be very significant for the whole year. Next slide, please. So going back, I'm going to go back just to show you the charts from the cycle itself, and I'm only going to spend a few minutes on each one. So we have at least a snapshot here for those who are going to be watching the video. You can always stop this and look at it and study it if you wish. But this is the chart from Washington, D.C. of when Saturn and Uranus started this cycle on February 12th of 1988. And the chart is 7:16 p.m., 7:16:02 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Washington, D.C., Virgo rising. And you can see where is it? There it is, the very end. You can see the Saturn and the Uranus at 29 degrees 55 Sag. And interesting, look how close Mars is there as a part of that at 23 degrees 39 minutes. But this was the seed for their whole cycle, 29 degrees Sagittarius. And think about how travel is so much in the crosshairs right now, and how education is right now, like higher education, campuses, how that, now a lot of the campuses have online, so there are some being able to shift, but that may be an interesting thing that comes about during the reorientation of the final square, the waning square next year. That from that period to the closing to the new cycle is going to be what we are the things that are being really changed dynamically, those things. And the moon was also in Sag at that moment of this cycle. The people in this picture, the emotions, and especially Sagittarius. Sagittarius loves its freedom. Boy, are we all looking at that right now. Some of us are very comfortable being in our four walls at long periods of time, but there are a lot that are feeling that restriction and how they have to adapt and figure out ways to, scratch the itch. Many of us still go out and go for walks, but we still have to keep the distance from people. So that was the chart for the beginning of the Saturn and Uranus cycle. So let's go to the next slide. Take a peek at, next slide, please. Next slide, please.
I've got the next slide up. Can you see it?
Oh, there it goes. I got it. It was a little delay. Thank you. Okay, so this was the first square that I talked about earlier, just so you can see it in chart form. This is, of course, out of Washington, D.C. The first square, the first hit was July 17th, 1999, so I'm just doing that one. But you can see that was 6:49 p.m., so 6:49, 56 seconds p.m. Eastern Daylight Time of Washington, D.C. on July 17th, 1999. And the first square has the Saturn at 15 degrees Taurus and Uranus at 15 degrees Taurus, 37 minutes. Why is that one still in 36? Maybe I grabbed the wrong slide, but it's close enough. I'll have to double check. But it's supposed to be 15 degrees, 37 minutes. I have a report for all of those, but maybe that slide didn't pull the right one. Anyway, you can still see the square. And what's interesting is I kind of switched the Saturn in the Taurus versus the Uranus in the Uranus is in the Aquarius, huh? So I think that period of time would be very interesting to kind of look at what was the crises. What were the crises we were handling then? And they're going to be switched now. So it's kind of interesting. But we have other things that have happened and through, the Pluto moving through Capricorn and the new cycle of Saturn with the Pluto is really important to kind of keep that from the bigger picture perspective here. But it's still helpful to look at just what was happening at that first square. What were some of the crises? Are we handling the same thing again, but in a different kind of context? And that's super valuable to look at. And you can look at each of the other areas of the chart, because we always have to keep in mind the whole chart. But if you're really honing in on something from a cycle perspective between two planets, that does help. So look at the Uranus in this particular, the first square, where Uranus was in the second house. So, and Saturn was in the fourth, and just about to go into the fifth house. So there, again, something related to our money and our stability and how secure we feel. And there's a volatility there, or there's changing in how we operate with it. Online banking has come in a big, I don't know if it was exact at that period, but how we process our money, how we spend our money, how much digital is involved in the money exchanges that go on. And but that's also what we value, right? How's a changing paradigm, especially with the Uranus and the Aquarius at that first square. Really powerful. There's other things I'm sure you can find on Wikipedia for the year 1999, and poke around in there and look at some of the top stories that summer, especially, and then into later that fall and winter, because that would still be kind of operating. So next slide, please. So that's the first square. So this was at full phase peak. This was November 4th, 2008. A lot of us remember 2008, 2009 because the crunch that happened, financial markets crashing. So that was full peak moment of the cycle. And here's a big question for you. How much did we learn? What did we do? Are we still doing, how are our actions related to how we handle our money, what we do with our money, how we invest, how we operate there, because that is part of this cycle as we close, because we're going to be reoriented. We're in reorientation of how we manage that, how we look at that. I don't know the end result of that, but I think we will change how we operate with our money in some way. Of course, at that same time, we had kind of a first in the United States anyway, and I'm sure maybe in other areas of the globe, there were some firsts in the political arena, which then influenced big things, such as how we operate with our money, our currency, maybe the currency changed, these kinds of things, but all of these. But in this instance, we have Uranus in the Pisces and Saturn in the Virgo. So they were in mutable signs at the peak moment. So it kind of changes. So those are at a square just by sign to the new cycle of Sag moment, that 29 degrees Sag, 55 minutes, right? So these are by sign, widely by degree, but I probably wouldn't even go there with a degree because that's 10, maybe 11. It's like 11. No, it's more than that. So it's, well, maybe some people might put that because they're with Uranus as an outer planet, but definitely by sign. And interesting, look at the peak moment here in this chart for Washington, D.C. Pluto is at that degree of 29 degrees Sag. Very interesting. So you can kind of see interesting things pop up when you do these explorations of the cycle, and you can look at each of these charts and go into a lot more detail and exploring the archetypal themes for Washington, D.C. especially, which would be for the United States, and compare this chart or the charts of the cycle to your country, and kind of pull out themes that we are all navigating through as a collective group. For this chart, the time is November 4th, 2008, Washington, D.C., District Columbia, at 5:54 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that is a very interesting chart, and the rising sign is in Scorpio, with Mercury very close by. So that's the peak moment. Next chart, please. So before we reach the true square next year, between for the waning square of Saturn and Uranus, we actually have a new cycle happening with Jupiter and Saturn at the end of this year. And I think that will shift things that were with Jupiter related, because Jupiter is the ruler of the Sag. And I'm pulling in Sag here because it was the sign, 29 degrees, 55 minutes of the seed moment of the Saturn-Uranus cycle that we're in. And that will shift things, I think, with kind of the early signs of what things kind of need a full makeover. Like the airlines. I'm sure the airlines will have to really shuffle and figure out other ways of how they operate to be in business, and how are they going to operate for the collective, and is there more government involvement in how they operate, right? Like, because the airlines is how this virus moved, right, across boundaries quickly. Then once it was people landed into their communities going home after things, that's how it spread. So that, I would imagine there would be some kind of real reorientation in terms of long distance travel, number one. Another one is the cruises. The cruises might not even survive this, because I don't know, is it collectively that be something that survives this in the Jupiter and Saturn cycle? Maybe there's a shift. Don't know. that's probably on the table as well in the collective of how the cruise, the business of the industry of cruising happens. But Neptune is still in Pisces. I imagine there'll be something, but what will it be? Don't know. And what are the parameters for how the groups come together and new rules of how we operate together in groups like that, where we might be more vulnerable to such things. We have to keep that in mind. And because this is new, because if we think back to like 07, 08, when we were dealing with the swine flu scenario, it was just the flu, people having it and dealing with it, and it wasn't as serious as nature is this. And I think this brings into our consciousness as a collective how vulnerable we are to, the microscopic viruses in the world. So it's kind of like, how does that change our behaviors? And so this new cycle of Jupiter and Saturn, what are other things? We're not there yet. Jupiter's not yet in the sign of Aquarius, so we don't know what that's going to look like until we're in it. However, we can kind of look at what was, the last Jupiter cycle there, but it wouldn't have the combination that we're moving into with the Saturn and the whole new 200-year cycle of Jupiter and Saturn coming together in the sign in air signs. So there are a lot of things shifting and coming into our consciousness that we will adapt to, or how we change our behaviors and the like. So keep that in mind, because it's not yet in the final square reorientation. All the information and things that you're experiencing now will create new desires for you, or what you value will change. And so those, kind of keep those in mind. What's coming in? Are you able to listen in to your inner world? And I think those who explore and use astrology have a little bit more fine-tuned brush on that. And they can use the tool to help themselves and navigate with so many changing parts in our collective. Thank you. Next slide. And here, this is February 17th, 2021 at 2:05 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in Washington, D.C. So the Eastern Standard Time for this chart. So this is where the first hit of the closing square. So I don't know if others read extensively on New York Times or anything, but there's, kind of some stories already coming out about how long this could be that we operate with some kind of continuing of the social distancing at various individual levels, until we have an understanding of how we will operate. We don't know all that yet. So this closing square makes me wonder about, are we looking at just how we're operating with this new information? And now it's kind of a little bit more like, okay, we're here. We're not going back anywhere to what we were before. And how do we, what's new? What's changing? How am I going to live my daily life? How am I going to be going to work? How am I managing my family? All these things that you have to adapt to. And this is the closing square moment. And look at all that Aquarius. The sun is in Aquarius at 29 degrees. Pallas Athena is at 23 degrees of Aquarius. Venus is at 20 degrees Aquarius. Jupiter's at 14 degrees Aquarius. Mercury in that moment is at 11 degrees Aquarius on the retrograde cycle. And I think that's the one that's retrograde. And then we have Saturn in Aquarius at 7 degrees, 13 minutes. And Uranus also at 7 degrees, 13 minutes in Taurus. And with Taurus, we have the moon in Taurus at 7, right? So it's right conjunct that Uranus. Wow, right? And then, we also have Black Moon Lilith in Taurus at 16 degrees and Mars at 21 degrees Taurus as well at the moment of the closing square, the first. So this is the moment, the beginning of the closing square. So this really speaks to a significant change in really the Aquarian energy. How much of the behaviors of now in the social distancing, we are still in that reorientation and still doing that? Are we practicing that then too? Are we moving? How are we distributing our goods, our resources? That's the Taurus. How is the money? These are all the Taurus as well. So it's kind of like interesting. What a dynamic chart. And Pluto is still finishing off Capricorn in that moment as well. And it doesn't reach there till 2023, if I have that correct in my brain. But this is an interesting chart to explore for this closing this cycle with Saturn and Uranus. From the United States of America, of course, I would encourage you to do for your own country, just to have that perspective, because each country has a different relationship with how the astrology works over astrocartography. I hope I said that right, or location astrology. I think that would be a fascinating subject to look at now, because definitely is playing into some of the storylines of what we're dealing with now. So take a look at that. There are a couple astrologers who I would recommend, and I'll put that in the comment section with the video later. But I think it's fun to study those things, because it gives you an interesting understanding of your relationship to the collective location that you are in, where you live on the earth, and then also the cosmic relationship with that, and cycles. So I think that's super valuable, and I think astrology is going to come on more and more. I really think that's an Aquarian theme that it can help us navigate and help us understand ourselves within the context of all these things. So that's February 17th, 2021, and of course there will be that's the first hit, and there's retrograde, and then back again on that. So next slide, please. I think then the new cycle, we'll reach the new cycle for Saturn or Uranus. This is just a sneak peek far off in the future, but it's not that far off. It's a Jupiter cycle. 2032 is 12 years away from today, or from this year, right? That's a Jupiter cycle. So it's kind of interesting. June 28th, 2032 is when the next Saturn and Uranus cycle begins, and they will begin in the sign of Gemini. Another air sign, very interesting. And 28 degrees, which is interesting because it's opposite of the last cycle was 29 degrees Sag. So this is the other, it's like the flipped scenario. So interesting. So this may be fun to kind of look at, and if you have extra time. But that's kind of where the next cycle is where we're headed. And that's an Aquarian thing, is to look into the future. I don't know if you want to look 12 years into the future. Maybe you do. But we're definitely in this moment in time that the waning square is realized next year, and that period of time until till 2032 is the reorientation. And so there's a lot of things that materialize, fade away, and the new things are just becoming like the beginning seeds of what will land into the new cycle. But some things won't even land into the new cycle of 2032 because they haven't been lived yet. That's still 11, 12 years there to understand ourselves in different frames of context and how we are connected and how we operate as communities. So this is worth looking at in terms of collectively what will the frame, the archetypal frame look like. Gemini, that to me speaks to how we communicate, how we move short distances, not the long distances, right? How that may change, or how maybe that becomes more significant because of what other things that we don't know yet, right? And Mercury would be very important here, and Mercury will be in Leo at that new cycle, right on the ascendant. So that's interesting. I can't see the exact degree of the ascendant, but it looks like it's sitting right on the ascendant. So that's very interesting, and quite a bit of Cancer in that new cycle for the Sun, and the Mars, and Venus. So how we are in our homes and how we are in our identity of, and how secure we feel, how vulnerable are we, how, you know, that's a lot of 12th house perspective there, from the Cancer in the 12th, for that Washington, D.C. chart for that new cycle. So it's very interesting to kind of look at these things in a big picture. I think it helps us kind of sit with the archetypes, listen, take notes for how we feel in the moment now. But I think some of us, it is fun to look at different perspectives that help us. Well, what do I want now? Things are changing. And it's really hard to maybe have a dream without knowing what the shape of anything would look like, right? And so it really requires more and more of us to go inside and really listen to the center of ourselves, for our higher understanding of how we're connected to the whole thing. And it may, you know, many of us may come forward with a new, I have a new mission in life, or a new calling, because it just kind of comes in the moments, when we're still like this, and then we don't know why fully, but it's where the passion is and where we feel directed to. And I think more of that is coming in as well. So I don't have anything else. I want to thank you for participating today. And I will share in the comments, either in the group and even maybe within the YouTube of this video, some other things I've compiled in data that people may want to look at. If they don't have the Solar Fire software, I can share some of the reports that I pulled. Anyway, thank you very much.
Sarah, thank you so much. This was an absolutely excellent meeting, and I'm just unmuting everyone. Please thank Sarrah Christensen.
Awesome,
Thank you,
Sarah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.